So what are some of the advantages, disadvantages of these two designs? So the advantage of, one advantage of the independent groups design is that there are no order effects. So half of your subjects go to do one part of the experiment, half of your subjects go to do the other part of the experiment. There's no order effects because they're only experiencing one aspect, one level of that independent variable. So you do not have to worry about order effects. On the downside for repeated measures, you need to control for order effects. So as I just mentioned, you would not want to have everybody do the experimental group first and then do the control condition afterwards. You would want to make sure that you randomize the order of those two so that half of the subjects were in the experimental condition first and then the control condition. Half of the subjects were in the control condition first and then the experimental condition. And notice that this is not something you got to worry about with the independent groups design, because there's an order to the conditions here, but there is no order to the conditions here because you're either in the control group or you're in the experimental group. So you don't have to worry about order effects. You don't have to worry about things like people getting tired. You don't have to worry about things like people experiencing the control condition first and then figuring out what they're supposed to do in the experimental condition. There's no order effects for a independent groups design. All right, so that's one of the first advantages. The other advantage is it's related to order effects. There's no carryover effects, right? There's no carryover effects to independent groups designs. There are carryover effects possible with an repeated measures design. So let's take a look at how that might happen. So let's say that we wanted to, we'll stick with the example of violence on TV. We wanted to study what's the effect of violence on TV on aggressive behavior. So if we do a repeated measures design and we show 6 subjects a very violent TV program and then measure their violent behavior, right? That would be the experimental condition. If we then said, all right, well, here's a non-violent TV show to watch now, and they watch a non-violent TV show, and then we measure their aggressive behavior again, what might happen is that the violence that they viewed in the experimental condition might carry over into their behavior in the control condition, right? Kind of like with Halloween Upon Us, some of you might indulge in some horror movies. Horror movies have massive carryover effects because whenever you watch a horror movie, every creak in your house exposes that carryover effect, right? There was, I think it was Demetri Martin, he's a comedian, and he once said he wishes other movies worked like that. He wishes like after you watch a comedy film and you hear a creak in the house, you'd be like, whoa, that sounded hilarious, right? But it doesn't work. Horror movies have huge carryover effects. So maybe if they watched violent TV here and then showed violent behavior and then watched non-violent TV, they might still show violent behavior. It might still carry over and affect the outcome of watching non-violent TV. And while you can mitigate that by having that randomized, it still has the possibility that participating in the first condition will change your behavior in the second condition. On the other hand, in an independent groups design, these people over here, these subjects over here, will never experience the nonviolent TV program. So there's no way that the nonviolent TV program can carry over its effects. This group down here will never experience the violent TV program. So once again, no chance that the violent TV will carry over and influence their behavior. No carryover effects in the independent groups design. All right, so those are the advantages of the independent groups design and the disadvantages of the dependent groups design. Any questions on those so far? All right, so So far, we've talked about the advantages for this and disadvantages of for repeated. What are the advantages for the repeated measures and the disadvantages for the independent groups design? So one of the big disadvantages for the independent groups design is that it requires many participants. And depending upon the design of your experiment, tons of participants. Whereas the repeated measures design requires much fewer participants. So if we take a look at our two experimental designs here, you will notice that I have 6 subjects in this condition, and I have 6 subjects in this condition. I had 6 in the experimental condition, and I had 6 in the control condition, and the total number of subjects that I needed for that was 6 subjects. And if I added a third condition, I would still only need 6 subjects to do my experiment. And if I added a fourth condition, I would still only need 6 subjects to do my experiment. So 6 subjects goes a long way in a repeated measures design. With an independent groups design, you can't do it with 6 subjects. So to get 6 in one condition and 6 in another condition, I needed 12 subjects total. And if I added another condition, I would need 18 subjects. And if I added a fourth condition, I would need 24 subjects. And really, 6 subjects in each condition is a really low number. You would probably want 20 subjects in each condition. In a repeated measures design, in order to do that, you need 20 subjects. In an independent groups design, for this one here, you need 40 subjects. So it quickly escalates, and it makes the actual doing of the experiment very, very difficult, very challenging, very resource intensive, because you have to recruit the subjects, you have to pay the subjects a lot of times, you need time to run all those subjects, so that is one of the disadvantages. The big one though, and the one that, one of the reasons I really like the repeated measures design, is that in the independent groups design, you cannot control for individual differences. Whereas in the repeated measures design, you can control for individual differences. So what does this mean? Well, sticking with the violence in TV example, it was suggested that maybe one of the differences between the two groups, maybe one of the differences that led to more violence in one group compared to another group, was that we had an exceptionally violent individual in one of the groups, right? Let's just say that we just ended up with this green individual here, and they're just one of those uber violent, horrific individuals that you read about in the news sometimes. All right, so they're massively violent. This violent individual is going to be compared to these individuals over here, some of which are going to be very non-violent. So I realize I chose the colors for this wrong, but anyways, stick with me. So this incredibly violent individual here will affect the average for this group. Let's say that this individual is very passive. This very passive, non-violent individual here will affect the average for this group. And it's going to skew your results, not because of your independent variable, but because of your individual subject characteristics. So we try to minimize these individual characteristics using randomization, and we try to minimize these individual characteristics by having a lot of subjects, because this one violent individual is really going to raise the bar when you only have 6 subjects in this group. If you had 100, then this one violent individual would get averaged out much more. But still, notice that we need now 100 subjects. We get back into that, very, very many subjects. So it would be great if we could have a very violent person in this category and a very violent person in this category. It would be great if we could have a very passive individual here and a very passive individual here. And that is built in to the design of the repeated measures experiment. Because in a repeated measures experiment, the people in the experimental group are the same as the people in the control group. So if we have an extremely violent individual, well, he is going to be an extremely violent individual in the experimental group, and he's going to be an extremely violent individual in the control group as well. Meaning that he's going to uptick the amount of violence in this group the same as he's going to uptick the amount of violence in this group. So his uber violence gets canceled out. He cancels out his own individual characteristics. He controls for, is the word that they use, his individual differences. And this very passive individual there is going to be very passive in the experimental group. It's going to be very passive in the control group. He is going to control for his own extreme passivity, and that is going to take out or factor out those individual differences. So if we had somebody who came in, well, these are children. If we had somebody that came in with a lack of sleep, they're going to have a lack of sleep in the experimental group. They're going to have a lack of sleep in the control group. If we had somebody come in and they just had a huge lunch, so they're feeling a little lethargic, they're going to be lethargic in the experimental group. They're going to be lethargic in the control group. If we have somebody who's afraid of the experimenter, right? These are children. They're going to be afraid of the experimenter in the experimental group. They're going to be afraid of the experimenter in the control group. So any individual differences that these subjects have, they're going to control for those or factor those out by the fact of they're going to be compared to themselves. So this repeated measures design is great because it allows you to detect very small differences between groups. It's a very precise kind of scalpel type experiment where you don't need a lot of subjects, partially because they run in every single condition, but also because any individual differences are factored out from the fact that both conditions contain the same people. So that being able to control for individual differences is one of the big reasons why the repeated measures design is basically used. If you can use it, you will basically go with the repeated measures design. All right, so a few more advantages, disadvantages that we have for the independent groups design. Oh, first off, are there any questions on these advantages, disadvantages so far? Make sense? All right, continuing on, other things. So in the independent groups design, you can investigate relatively permanent change. So you can investigate change that occurs either permanently, occurs over hours, occurs over days, or maintains itself over days. Whereas in the repeated measures design, you usually cannot research relatively permanent change because you cannot put that subject into a second experimental condition. If they've already changed and it's relatively permanent, we can't put them into a second experimental condition. So if you wanted to test, for example, different techniques for reducing anxiety, right? And you were testing different techniques for reducing anxiety, and you taught somebody, you wanted to test between breathing techniques and a counting technique, right? So breathing techniques, one of them is like slow your breath in through your nose, out through your mouth. Counting techniques is, start at 20 and count backwards until you reach 0. And you want to know which one of those two is more effective. Well, learning is a relatively permanent change. So if you put somebody in the first group and you say, all right, I'm going to teach you these breathing techniques, and then you put them in a stressful situation and you say, use your breathing techniques, they will. However, they've learned that breathing technique. So then later when you tell them, use the numbers technique in the second condition, they're liable to use that breathing technique as well, right? They're liable to not be able to be measured again because of that relatively permanent change. So you wouldn't want to put them in the repeated measures, measure them twice. You would want to only measure them the one time. Independent groups designs, this is a big one here. You can investigate and research quasi-independent variables. And quasi-independent variables are variables that you can divide people on, but you cannot randomly assign. In a repeated measures variable, you can you cannot divide people because they're experiencing every single instance. So this is one of the big ones that kind of locks some research into quasi-independent variables. So questions of interest or variables of interest, quasi-independent variables of interest, include things like gender. So there's a lot of research that is done on sex differences, gender differences between males and females, and that is a quasi-independent variable because the experimenter cannot manipulate that variable. The experimenter can take a subject and say, all right, you're male, I'm going to put you in the male group. You're female, I'm going to put you in the female group, and then we're going to see if there's any differences between the groups, right? We can split them up into two different groups where the males are measured for their behavior, the females are measured for their behavior, and that is that independent groups design. We cannot use a repeated measures because we can't take a subject and say, all right, we're going to flip a coin, and for the first part of the experiment, you're going to be a male. Poof, I made you into a male. Please complete this survey. And then they complete the survey, and you say, all right, now we're going to do the second part of the experiment. You're going to be a female. Poof. Now you're a female. Please complete this survey. We can't, right? We can't randomly assign some of these quasi-independent variables. So things like gender, the experimenter cannot assign. Things like age, the experimenter cannot assign. Things like socioeconomic status, if you want to know the differences between people that come from high socioeconomic status, rich people, people that come from low socioeconomic status, poor people, we don't have the resources to assign that. We can't have somebody show up to the lab and say, all right, well, let me flip a coin. Oh, you're going to be in the high socioeconomic status group. So here's a check for $1 million. There you go. Go off into your group over there. And the next person comes in, you flip a coin, and you say, oh, sorry, you're in the low socioeconomic status group. So let me hack into your bank account. We'll just clear all that out. You are now worth 0. And you can go over there into that experimental room. We can't do that, right? We're interested in what is the effects of socioeconomic status on behavior, but we can't repeatedly measure people in different conditions because we can't manipulate it. In those instances, we have to use an independent groups design where we will ask somebody, what's your family income? And depending upon their answer, we'll say, okay, that places you in the high socioeconomic group. Okay, that places you in the low socioeconomic group. And then we can see if there's any differences between those two groups. All right, any final questions about the experimental designs, independent and repeated measures, or anything else we covered today? We're all good? All right.